I'm counting this as a Christmas movie, I don't care. Hello everyone, Merry Christmas and welcome to another festive rewind review. In this video we are taking a trip to Halloween Town to take a look at Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Released in 1993, this stop-motion animated movie sees Jack Skellington, king of Halloween Town, discovers a place called Christmas Town, but his attempts to bring Christmas to his home causes confusion. Based on a story and characters created by Tim Burton, The Nightmare Before Christmas was adapted for screen by Michael McDowell, with a screenplay by Caroline Thompson and directed by Henry Selick, and features the vocal talent of Danny Elfman, Chris Sarandon, Catherine O'Hara, William Hickey, Glenn Shaddy, Paul Rubens, Ken Page, Ed Ivory, Greg Proops, Susan McBride, Debbie Durst, Kerry Katz, Randy Crenshaw, Sherwood Ball, Carmen Twilley and Glenn Walters. The debate for whether or not this movie is a Christmas movie or a Halloween movie has raged ever since it was released in cinemas. And there's an argument that can be made for both sides. Personally, and you are going to question why it is that I'm doing this review in December, I tend to lean towards this movie being classified as a Halloween movie, purely because I do think that it is a lot darker and a lot spookier than you would expect a Christmas movie to be. Plus, the majority of this movie takes place in a land called Halloween Town. But at the same time, the Christmas sequences and imagery are far more ingrained into my memory than the Halloween stuff. If I ever think about Jack Skellington from this movie, I am much more likely to picture him in a snowy setting. So it is debatable whether you think this movie is a Halloween movie or a Christmas movie, but honestly, it is a personal choice. It's either a lighter, feel-good Halloween movie or a darker, edgier Christmas movie. It is your choice. When it comes to my history with this movie, I honestly can't actually remember the first time that I ever watched this, but this did become one of those go-to Christmas movies when I was a kid, alongside things like The Muppet Christmas Carol and Elf. I used to have it on tape, then I had it on DVD, and now I've got it on Blu-ray. And it is a movie that I have always been fond of. The story for Nightmare Before Christmas sees the Pumpkin King himself, Jack Skellington, becoming tired of the usual spooks and scares he conjures up over the Halloween season. But that all changes when he stumbles across Christmas Town and decides to give Christmas a shot himself, making toys, flying the sleigh, and of course replacing Santa Claus. Meanwhile, Sally, a creation of the mad scientist Dr. Finkelstein, has a vision of the future and she attempts to stop Jack before he makes a terrible mistake. So essentially it boils down to Jack Skellington having a midlife crisis and havoc ensues. It is a really fun idea though, with lots of potential, and the way it goes about telling this story is simple and easily accessible to all audiences. But this being a Tim Burton movie, it means that there's a lot of very twisted, very dark ideas, as well as some slightly darker and edgier comedy sprinkled throughout. Some characters are able to stitch themselves together, pull off body parts, one is made out of bugs, Santa Claus becomes a prisoner of the boogeyman, the kids all argue and sing over how best to kidnap someone in increasingly extreme ways. God, I miss these kinds of PG movies. It's very messed up, but it can be funny. I will say though that there are a lot of elements in this movie that to me don't really make a lot of sense. I've never really understood how this world works, why the holidays don't cross over more, how none of the holidays seem to know about each other, how they access the real world, and there's also a lot of history and backstory with the characters that never gets addressed. And I don't think that it helps that the main characters barely interact with each other. Like, they have a couple scenes together, but that's really it. But to be fair, none of that is the main focus of this story, and due to the short runtime, it does make sense why it is that none of that stuff really does need to be addressed, and they only focus on what's important. It is a movie that is quite easy to poke holes in, and you will find yourself having a fair few questions depending on how nitpicky you are, but I think for a movie like this, just go with it. Enjoy it for what it is, and I'm sure you'll have a fun time. I have always wondered why it is that Tim Burton, or even Disney, has never really decided to ever come back and revisit this world before, outside of things like Kingdom Hearts. There is a load of potential stories that you could make set within this world, and I've always been kind of curious to just have a little bit of a peek behind those other doors. The closest that we get to having a peek behind those other doors is that there is a small cameo from the Easter Bunny when Lock, Shock and Barrel accidentally kidnap the wrong person. I think that there are a lot of stories that you could tell with these characters set within this world, and they could be really fun if they are done right. I mean, Tim Burton has started revisiting some of his older properties like Beetlejuice, so I do think that there is an opportunity there for them to revisit this world. But at the same time, Nightmare Before Christmas is only focused on wanting to tell this story, and it does it, and it ties it all up in a nice little bow. So maybe it's for the best. One aspect that helps tell the story, as well as make this movie as memorable as it is the incredible soundtrack by Tim Burton's longtime collaborator Danny Elfman. This is easily one of my favourite Danny Elfman soundtracks, and it is absolutely one of his most memorable too. It helps set the tone quite well by highlighting the darker and quirkier elements. It's a very catchy soundtrack because there are a lot of moments that do get replayed and recycled throughout the course of the movie, plus most of the characters do have their own themes. All of those themes are very memorable, and a part of the reason for that, or at least I think part of the reason for that, is the fact that all of those themes are linked or tied to a song. Yes, for those who have never seen this movie before, The Nightmare Before Christmas is a full-blown musical boasting some absolutely excellent songs and some wonderful music sequences. All of the songs are properly ingrained into this movie in a really natural way. They help push everything forwards, and it kind of fills in on what's going on with the characters. It helps tell you and inform you what it is that they are feeling, as well as what they're thinking. Some of the songs are really big, grand and theatrical, and some of them are really nice, really quiet and really subtle. In all honesty, I think that this could be easily adapted into a stage musical. You wouldn't really need to change that much either. I know there have been attempts in the past by a few different theatre companies to make one. I'm not quite sure how those turned out. I don't think there's ever been actually an official one by Disney, but I do think that it would be really good if they were to do it. The music and songs are hugely important to this movie, and if they were removed, if this movie did not have the soundtrack that it does have, I don't think that it would be anywhere near as good, as memorable, and I definitely think that it would feel a lot emptier. And while we're on the subject, I do need to quickly mention something else. Back in 2008, Disney Records actually released a brand new album to celebrate the 15th anniversary of Nightmare Before Christmas, and it featured a lot of rock and heavy metal artists, and they were doing renditions of the songs that are featured in this movie, and it's really good. There's artists like All American Rejects, Rise Against, Marilyn Manson, as well as Amy Lee from Evanescence. Flyleaf do a version of What's This, which I'll be honest is not my favourite. I think the style that they have with Lacey Strum doing the vocals would probably best be suited for either Sally's song or This Is Halloween, but it is okay. I do like a lot of their stuff, so I'm not really complaining. Weirdly, my favourite song on the revisited album is actually pretty morbid. A band called Korn does a rendition of Kidnap the Sandy Claus, and it really highlights just how messed up and twisted that song actually is. I love it! It is genuinely worth listening to if you never have before. Definitely give it a go if it sounds like something that you'd be interested in. I kinda hope that Disney do more like it one day in the future, but it is doubtful. It's a shame because they could have a lot of fun with it. Anyway, there's a really great mix of characters in this, and all of the main ones are distinctly memorable, with the Pumpkin King himself, Jack Skellington, as the lead. Jack is voiced by Chris Sarandon, with Danny Elfman himself providing the singing vocals. He's a very theatrical character, from the way that he moves to the way that he talks and sings. I think he has a great design, and his motivations are easy enough to understand, and he does get some really great scenes. That being said, I do think that his characterisation can be a little bit simple, and that's kind of across the board for pretty much all the characters that are featured in this movie. It does mean that this is a little bit more accessible and a little bit more easy to understand for younger viewers, but there is a little bit more room that I do think that they could have improved on. I do think that they could have done a little bit more with these characters. I'm not entirely sure what with the limited runtime that this movie does have, but I do think that there is opportunities and room for them to explore and develop these characters a little bit more. I do like Jack Skellington though. He is one of my favourite Tim Burton creations. He gets some absolutely incredible sequences, he gets some absolutely brilliant songs, arguably the most iconic song of the entire movie, and that shot of Jack all silhouetted when he's standing on that little spiral hill with the moon behind him, that is one of the most iconic shots that has ever been featured in an animated movie. I think Sally's pretty good too, with a very messed up but very memorable design that does come into play multiple times throughout the movie, where she's able to detach limbs when she wants and stitch herself back together again. Like Jack, she is a very straightforward character with very simple goals, and I do think that they could probably do more with her. I do like how proactive she is within the story and acts as a good counterpoint to Jack. I'm actually pretty surprised that she isn't voiced by Helena Bonham Carter. I was convinced for years that she was, but nope, the voice actress is actually Catherine O'Hara, and she is fantastic. I think these are decent, fun and quirky characters. All the characters in this movie are, and they are all instantly memorable and recognisable, but as I said when I was talking about Jack, I do think that the characterisations of pretty much all the characters in this movie are quite simplistic. I do think that it does make them feel a little bit two-dimensional, and I do think that they could have done a lot more with them. One example of something that I think that they could have developed a little bit more is the romantic subplot between Jack and Sally. I'm going to be completely honest, I have never bought into the romantic relationship between Jack and Sally in all the years that I've been watching this movie. And I think that a large part of the reason for that is because you barely see these characters actually interacting with each other. You know, you see Sally pining for Jack, but Jack barely really sees Sally outside of just like asking her help to design the Santa costume, but that's really it. There isn't any actual romantic sequences between them until the very end. So I do think that that is one thing that they could have improved on a lot more. And the same goes for the rivalry between Jack Skellington and Oogie Boogie. Oogie Boogie is meant to be the main antagonist of this movie, but again, he's barely actually in the movie, and the scenes that he and Jack share are honestly just the one, and it's right at the end. There's obviously a lot of history between them, but they barely do anything with it. They barely acknowledge what has actually happened, and because they barely interact with each other, there's no rivalry or anything built up over the course of the movie. You do have the scene where Jack does tell Lock, Shock and Barrel to not interact with Oogie Boogie or let him interfere in what's going on with the Christmas stuff, but that's really it. You don't actually know what it is that Oogie Boogie would do with this and how he would actually fit into the plot. You see what he does with Santa, and honestly that is quite messed up. But the actual rivalry between Oogie Boogie and Jack, I just don't really buy it, and I just don't think that it's built up enough. Oogie doesn't actually get introduced until quite late on into the movie, like it's a good way through before you actually see him. But he has such a large presence when he does show up, with the amazing vocal performance from Ken Page and that fantastic song, that it does feel like he is a much larger part of this movie. In my opinion, he is one of the scarier characters in this film. His design at first glance is quite simple, with him basically just looking like a rag with a face. But it's not until you get a slightly more closer look at him that you start to notice just how much more complex his design actually is. And when you see what's under that rag, it is really gross, and it is really clever. I do really enjoy what all of the characters do bring to this movie. From Lock, Shock and Barrel, voiced by Pee Wee Herman himself, Paul Rubens, and both Danny Elfman and Catherine O'Hara doing double time with their vocal performances. The two-faced mayor, because of course he is, voiced by Glenn Shaddy. I quite like the band that pops up a few times providing the music too. And Dr. Finkelstein, voiced by William Hickey, the mad scientist who is able to scratch his own brain because why not? That's Tim Burton for you. I will admit I'm not a humongous fan of the way that Santa is portrayed in this movie, voiced by Ed Ivory, but the way that he is portrayed does fit the tone that this movie does go for, and it does make sense considering everything that he gets put through. I've got to be honest, I'm finding it quite difficult not referring to this movie as a Tim Burton movie, because it technically isn't one. He didn't direct or write this movie, but he is one of the producers. And I believe this is actually based on a poem that he created back in 1982. That's why his name is over the title. And apparently the reason why he didn't direct this movie is because he was too busy doing Batman Returns. Another twisted Christmas movie. But even so, you do feel his presence here with some of the visuals and designs. It keeps the muted, darker colour palette of one of Tim Burton's movies with really pale, almost blue-tinted lights and really dark, foreboding shadows. All of the characters look like a Tim Burton drawing, and that even goes for the art style of Halloween Town and Christmas Town as well. Halloween Town especially because that maintains that spookier gothic kind of atmosphere that you would expect from a Tim Burton movie. So it is easy for people, including me, to get confused about this movie being a Tim Burton movie. I really think director Henry Selick has done a fantastic job of giving this movie its own feel, whilst also sticking quite close to the tone and atmosphere of one of Tim Burton's movies. It is really cool seeing how much Henry Selick has evolved as a director of stop-motion animated movies, because his most famous creation, his most famous movie that he has directed is Coraline. This movie, Nightmare Before Christmas, is the first feature-length movie that he ever directed. So it is really awesome getting to see just how different these movies are and seeing how much he has changed over the years. I've always really loved stop motion as an art form, and the kinds of things that you can do and the techniques and styles that you can add. They are so much harder and time-consuming to do compared to CG movies. Obviously technology has evolved and it has made things a lot easier for people to do and make things nowadays, but stop motion, the time that it takes to make those movies, hasn't ever changed, and I've always admired just how much time and effort that those animators have to put into making these movies. And because of how much time, work and effort that goes into making a stop motion animated movie, it does mean that there is potentially going to be a shorter runtime. The Nightmare Before Christmas is just under 1 hour 20 minutes long, But that's not really a bad thing at all. It means that the creators only focus on the most important things, and we get something that is more simplified and to the point. The stop motion work in this one overall is mostly pretty good. It's not quite on the same level as something like Coraline or Kubo and the Two Strings. It can feel a bit static like the older Aardman short, and they do keep it fairly simple. But I will admit, for characters like Jack the Vampires, the Mayor and Oogie Boogie, it does kind of fit, but not quite as much for characters like Sally and Santa. But there are a load of small, subtle details to some of these characters that do look really good. Like when some of the characters are wearing rags, or the clothes are all kind of ripped up and shredded, and what it is that they do with Zero, the ghost dog. Plus, I love the variety within the characters and the different techniques that they use to bring each of these characters to life. Prime example being characters like Oogie Boogie, who it turns out is just a rag full of small bugs that are all writhing and moving around. Sally keeps having to stitch herself together, and you see her doing it. Plus, there's another character that pops up in this movie. I have absolutely no idea who he is, what his name is or anything, but he's like made up of like all this like brown sludgy goo thing that just kind of sticks to things, and it's just constantly dripping off him. I don't know how they do that at all, but it looks really good. All of that stuff is some of the best animation work that is featured in this movie. And coming from somebody who has had a little bit of experience with stop motion, I am familiar with the techniques and methods that they use to bring stop motion to life, how they actually make a lot of these movies. I genuinely don't know how some of this stuff is done. It is just so far beyond what I can really think of when it comes to animation. I genuinely don't know how some of this is done. I also really like how they incorporate a number of 2D elements and techniques in this as well, whenever like the ghosts show up and start flying around, as well as whenever somebody starts playing around with fire, plus there's a few other things as well. All of it works really well, and none of it looks out of place. The animation overall is really good in this movie, and I think that a large part of the reason for that is what they do with the cinematography and lighting. Visually, this movie is absolutely dazzling with some incredible imagery and cinematography. Like most of Tim Burton's creations, there is an emphasis on shadows and dark images, and the way that light is used throughout is excellent. It almost looks like it has this ghostly glow with a very pale moonlight illuminating the scenery, and I like how different and contrasting the colour scheme is for each place, with Halloween Town looking a little bit more orangey brown during the day with lots of fog around, and an almost monochrome look at night, and then Christmas Town having lighter and more colourful visuals, candlelight and more. You really do feel the warmth, and I really like it. I really love how they play with lighting in this movie, and I genuinely want to know how it's done. Especially all those sequences down in Oogie Boogie's lair where it's all sort of lit up in all like neon lights. That looks absolutely incredible, and I have no idea how they do it. It's probably the simplest thing on planet Earth, but it is really good, and it is something that I want to know. It's actually quite clever what it is that they do with shadows in this movie as well, because there's actually one subtle thing that they do with Jack whenever he's moving around. They always do like a lot of backlighting with him, and you see a silhouette of him whenever he's moving around, a bit like what they do with Dracula. Again, that's another thing that I'm not entirely sure how it is that they do it, but it is really clever, and I like how it is incorporated. It's just like this really subtle reminder that even though he is quite a friendly character in the movie, that you are warming up to him, that you do root for him to succeed, he is still meant to be a scary character, and those sequences are there to remind you of that. I probably should say that yes, this is meant to be a family film. This is a movie that is oriented towards families. But I would stress caution for younger viewers. I mean, I'll admit I was pretty young when I first saw this. As I said, I can't actually remember the first time that I saw this movie, which I've got to be honest is a little bit odd considering the things that I was and wasn't allowed to watch when I was younger. But The Nightmare Before Christmas never actually bothered me, even though it is rated a PG, and it is rated a PG for a reason. So my advice for parents out there, for anyone with young kids, I would say check this movie out first before deciding whether or not to let those young kids see this movie or not. But I would definitely recommend checking this movie out. If you've never seen this movie before, I would absolutely say that this is worth your time. This is definitely worth a go, especially over the Christmas season. Or even save it for Halloween. It's your choice. The point is, it is a great movie and it is definitely worth a watch. Overall, I really like this movie. It isn't fantastic, it is quite short, and the characters and story are quite simplistic, but it has some fantastic fantastic visuals and lighting, the animation is really good, the characters are memorable, and the ideas are really interesting, dark, twisted and engaging. And matched with a fantastic soundtrack and songs, this is a great movie that is fun, easy to watch and weird in a way that only classic Tim Burton can do. The year that I'm reviewing this movie is 2023, that is 30 years after this movie was first released, and it is still good and it still holds up just as well. I would absolutely recommend checking this movie out if you can, but don't go into this with unrealistically high expectations. It does have a large fan base and following, and it is a staple for a lot of families and friends around Halloween or Christmas time, including mine. And there are a lot of people who absolutely adore this movie and praise it very, very highly. So my advice is to just sit back, enjoy it for what it is, and just have fun with it, and I am sure you will. So with all that being said, my rating for Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas is an 8 out of 10. Well, I think I've gone on long enough for this video, so it's time to wrap things up. Thank you very much for watching this video if you have. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you have seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.